Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to call this special briefing by our Senate Finance and Appropriations staff on the Budget Conference Committee report to order. Staff has prepared extensive information for us. You have about a 70-page briefing, and then you have another section that is the key features of this conference committee report. As they go through this, I would ask that you not ask questions until we come to the end of one of the sections. At the end of each section, please do ask any questions. We want them all answered before we get to the floor for an up or down vote on this document. But please don't interrupt them, because usually I've discovered they cover the point you're asking about a page or two later. So, April, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Turning to slide 4, I'll just restate that you might remember that the Senate had a number of priorities during the regular 2020 session. Many of those priorities have, in fact, been retained in the conference report. And just to start, you might remember that it was very important to make investments in the people of Virginia. Those were done in a number of areas, for instance, education. That includes the SOQ rebenchmarking, funding for early childhood, and then additional support, which has been restored for higher education. In health and human resources, this has to do with fully funding the Medicaid forecast, enhancing provider rates, adding waiver slots, and expanding permanent supportive housing. As far as employee compensation, you weren't able to restore as much in the conference report as before. However, the Senate priority of the retaining the sworn law enforcement bonus of $500 was retained. There is also a contingent state and state-supported local bonus in the second year, and language for the governor to include a K-12 compensation action in his introduced budget if revenues are sufficient. And I won't cover that in detail, as Adam will cover that in general government. In public safety, this was funding for criminal justice reform legislation and grant funding for body-worn cameras. And then there's also allocation of the federal coronavirus relief funds for a number of priorities and language addressing both housing evictions and utility disconnections during the pandemic. You did this in the conference report while also prioritizing structural balance, and this included a flexible deposit to the reserves in lieu of the rainy day fund deposit. And then that leaves a cushion for any potential economic downturn by having a larger than normal unappropriated balance, and I'll cover that in more detail in a minute. Turning to slide 5, there were a number of things that were agreed upon as the conferee started to negotiate a budget package, and that was first that the unappropriated balance should be no less than $300 million. You might remember the Senate budget was higher than that at about $480 million, but the agreement was no less than $300 million. And most of that was due to help to address one of the governor's concerns had been the amount of contingent spending items that were included in both budgets, though that the House appropriated theirs and the Senate's were unappropriated and were only going to go in effect if there was additional revenue. But that's where mostly that has been adjusted. We also worked with the administration to address the allocation of the coronavirus relief funds to include flexible language regarding the appropriation of those funds, which was similar to the Senate position, and possible changes in the guidance on spending by the federal government. The majority of the spending restores items that have been adopted in the regular session or that addresses criminal justice reform. Moving to slide 6, the conference amendments make a number of limited changes. That additional general fund net spending is at about $240 million, most of which, again, are restorations of unallotments that were scheduled to be deleted. And the unappropriated balance at the end of the biennium is $303.2 million. And that does incorporate the fiscal impact of criminal justice reform bills. In addition, there's about $6 million that's contained for criminal justice reform in central accounts, and that's due to some legislation not being completed by the time the conference report was put together, to give a little cushion there. There were additional saving and resource changes of about $280 million. I'll go into more detail on that in the coming pages. Again, allocation of the remaining federal coronavirus relief funds with some flexibility for the governor. And I mentioned that deposit to the revenue reserve versus the rainy day fund previously, which brings reserves to the end of the biennium to about $1.2 billion. And I mentioned the contingent employee bonus, and then there's a number of language and technical amendments that the other staff will cover. If you move to slide 7, This will just give you an idea of the available general fund resources from the introduced budget all the way through this process. And again, at the bottom right, you'll see that there's $303.2 million for the unappropriated balance at the end of the biennium. There's a number of things that we adjusted, and that includes some technical balance sheet adjustments related to another action in the WQF Part B, and so those were done. So that does explain some of the changes there. But again, the bottom line is the 303.2 unappropriated balance at the end of the biennium. Moving on to slide 8. This shows you the almost $280 million in additional savings and resource strategies, so additional resources or savings. A number of those were in the Senate budget. Those first three, capturing Medicaid managed care rate changes for the various programs, were in the Senate budget. ABC, we picked up some additional profits from 2020 that were unrecognized of about $11 million. That's above what the Senate did. And the amount for the capturing net profits coming into the next year, 2 years of 7.3 at ABC is a little higher than the Senate amount. Just to tell you one that we didn't have, under central appropriations, there's a health insurance premium holiday that nets about $46 million. Adam will go into more detail on that one. There's some additional funding related to some proposed changes related to taxes on heated tobacco, et cetera, that we pick up a little more revenue in conference on that. Under balances, the COVID-19 matching funds, we picked up $38.5 million versus what the Senate had, which was 30, so that was halfway between the Senate and the House position. And then some small balances in the World War II Commission and the Virginia Alcohol Safety Action Program. Turning to slide 9, this starts to break out the details of the Coronavirus Relief Fund commitments. You might remember when we previously talked about 1.8, 1.9 billion was committed, and there was a remaining balance of 1.3 billion. There was a large amount that went to the localities. That's on the first line. This is just a reiteration of something you've seen before. If you go to page 10, you'll see under the Conference of Amendments where some additional funding was allocated. And in fact, the governor has actually announced several of these since we put the package together. For instance, K-12, you might have heard the $220.8 million that the governor announced for helping to reopen the schools. You might have also noticed he mentioned, I believe his number was $73 million for the hazard pay for home health workers. The conference report had estimated that at 72. And then there's a number of items that weren't in the Senate budget, but you can see here, and I won't go into great detail, but this allocates them for those items. If you turn to slide 11, this captures the rest of those. I will mention previously in the House amendment that they had allocated amounts for higher ed institutions and other eds very specifically. This amendment does not do that specifically, but puts an upper rate limit on what one particular institution or agency could receive, and it's based on reimbursement. The language gives the governor some flexibility on at a date in December. If the items aren't spent this way, they can be reallocated amongst these various items, and also that if he gets to the end, that the balances go into the unemployment trust fund. There is an amount there for the unemployment trust fund back on slide, I believe, 10 at $210 million, but additional balances would also go there. And again, it gives the governor some flexibility, though he did have that in the Senate amendment. And then the last thing I'll say is if the federal government, for instance, changes the rules, he does have additional time based on any new date they come up with to allocate these funds. And Madam Chair, I will pause for questions.
Question?
Senator Favola.
Thank you. April, on page 8, slide 8, where we talk about the ABC additional profits for 2020 and also profits above the target revenue, are those dollars the result of some regulatory changes that ABC implemented as a result of, the stay-at-home order and some other changes in our business model because of the coronavirus, or were these revenues just part of the regular way we do business?
Madam Chair, Senator Favola, while that might have been a factor, it's my understanding that most of it was from increased volume, though I'll ask Caitlin Kilpatrick, who's on the line, if she has any additional information she wants to share about that.
Yes, Madam Chair, April, and Senator Favola, I think April is correct that there was just increased demand.
Madam Chair and Senator Favola, we'll be happy, though, to try to break that out for you further. So, thank you. All right, if there are no additional questions, Madam Chair, I can turn it over to Charles to cover commerce and trade and economic development. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles?
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Next slide, please. You will recall that the governor's introduced budget restored 84 million of the 118 million.
Charles, would you speak a little closer to the mic or louder?
I would be glad to. Is this better?
Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, you will recall that in the governor's introduced budget, the governor restored 84 million of the 118 million in unallotments under the Commerce and Trade Secretariat. Full restorations included funding for the Housing Trust Fund, broadband, and offshore wind. Partial restorations included the Eviction Prevention Diversion Program at $3.3 million and the Virginia Jobs Investment Program Grant Fund at $2 million. The introduced budget also proposed an additional $25 million for the Housing Trust Fund and an additional $15 million for broadband. There was also language in Part 4 that created a temporary eviction moratorium. The conference report endorses the governor's general fund spending amendments. It also captures additional savings in economic development, and includes several language amendments, including revisions to the eviction moratorium language. Next slide, please. And this slide just summarizes what I just explained in tabular form, including the restorations of unallotments and the new actions. Next slide. And these next few slides detail the amendments adopted in the conference report. Many of these are unallotments that were not subsequently restored, and so they appear as general fund reductions. In the interest of time, I will go over all the reductions that were included in the introduced budget, but rather I'll just mention the changes adopted in the conference report. So going down to the second row, the conference report removes appropriations for economic development incentives related to the Rolls-Royce facility. As you know, the facility is closing due to a COVID-related drop in demand in the aerospace industry. Moving down to the fourth row, this amendment postpones planned economic development incentive payments that are the result of project delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and updated performance data. Next slide. In housing and community development, there are two language amendments. The first one designates $12.5 million in the first year for the continuation of the rent and mortgage relief payment from the Housing Trust Fund appropriation. The program is currently funded with federal coronavirus relief funds, and that expires at the end of December. Further directs the department to use additional resources from the Housing Trust Fund to sustain the rent and mortgage relief program during the current state of emergency if necessary. The Second Amendment directs the Broadband Advisory Council to review a potential policy change for the Virginia Telecommunication Initiative that would potentially allow for public broadband authorities to apply directly for body funds without investment from the private sector. Next slide. This next slide reflects a handful of other conference amendments in commerce and trade. The first directs the Department of Small Business and Supplier Diversity to re-examine the Rebuild Virginia Grant Program guidelines with the intent to expand eligibility, including expanding the size of small businesses that are eligible from those with gross receipts of less than 1.5 million or 25 or fewer employees to those with average gross receipts of 10 million or less and 250 or fewer employees, and includes Virginia-based recreation and tourism small businesses. The next amendment directs the DEC to establish and maintain a position that would be responsible for investigating and responding to legislative inquiries. Next is a language amendment that directs the Chief Workforce Advisor to convene a work group to review the Commonwealth's state public works payment process to look into the prevalence of worker misclassification among contractors and subcontractors. Next, in the Department of Professional Occupational Regulation, language directs the Secretary of Commerce and Trade and others to work with stakeholders to update the COVID-19 personal care and grooming services guideline with regard to facial coverings in order for services such as facials to be performed in a safe and effective manner. The next amendment provides $5 million from non-general fund sources for a one-time grant program at the Virginia Biosciences Health Research Corporation designed to support the acceleration of clinical testing of a therapeutic drug that treats clinical symptoms caused by COVID-19. Lastly, there is an amendment to temporarily authorize the president and CEO of the Virginia Innovation Partnership Authority's managing nonprofit, the Center for Innovative Technology, or CIT, to approve funds provided for the Centers of Excellence appropriated in the Appropriation Act until such time as the VIPA Board of Directors is fully appointed. Next slide. And in Part 4 of the governor's introduced budget, as I mentioned, there was language that implemented a temporary moratorium on evictions until April 30, 2021. The conference report includes revised language that creates an eviction moratorium that expires at the end of the declared state of emergency, but no sooner than December 31, 2020. Before December 31, a landlord can begin eviction proceedings for non-payment of rent if a tenant refuses to apply and cooperate with a landlord's application for rental assistance through the Virginia Rent and Mortgage Relief Program. Then beginning on January 1, 2021, a landlord may evict a tenant for non-payment of rent after an application for rental assistance has been made by the tenant or the landlord, and the landlord has waited the appropriate 45 days for approval or denial of rental assistance. In addition, owners with more than 4 dwelling units, the language provides that if the tenant provides a signed statement certifying that he or she has experienced additional expenses or loss of income due to the declared state of emergency, the tenant may enter into a payment plan and amortize the amount owed over the lesser of 6 months or the remainder of the lease term. And Madam Chair, that concludes my summary of the conference amendments in the area of commerce and trade.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Charles?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Senator Eben.
Thank you for the presentation. I had a question about the eviction prevention and diversion pilot program and the affordable housing pilot program, because I see on slide number 14, it looks like, I guess that's the introduced budget, but it looks like, is that what are we spending there? What's the story with the eviction prevention and diversion pilot program and this affordable housing pilot program? Did that just get cut totally? Is that what happened?
Madam Chair, Senator Eben, that is a program that was in the original introduced budget last December that was adopted in Chapter 1289, and there was $3.3 million each year appropriated to the Department of Housing and Community Development for a program to help prevent eviction and divert tenants who are facing eviction into other services. All $6.6 million was unallotted in the governor's introduced budget in August. $3.3 million, or 1 year of that, was then restored.
Thank you.
Is there any further question? Thank you, Charles.
Good afternoon. Picking up on slide 20, this slide is an overview of the actions related to higher education. As you recall, in Chapter 1289, the budget from the regular session had included a net increase for higher education of about $284 million over the biennium, and nearly all of that was unallotted and not restored. These are key actions you recall, such as the Last Dollar Plus Community College Workforce Initiative, G3, need-based financial aid, and a tuition moderation funding pool. Instead, the conference report provides $94 million for funding the public institutions of higher education, as well as additional temporary flexibility to support auxiliaries, given the disproportionate impact there related to housing and dining, while also requiring institutions to consider their longer-term financial health measures. In addition, $120 million of the federal coronavirus relief funds are allocated to higher education, although not specifically by institution. And you may also be aware that there is currently a significant debt restructuring underway that will provide financial relief over a 20-month period, the first piece of which will require General Assembly approval in the regular session, but is not part of these actions. On slide 21 and 22 together goes through each of the amendments. Similar to what Charles mentioned, the introduced budget shows the conversion of what was first unallocated and then reduced for most of the items. I have just bolded the few exceptions to that. Their funding for Norfolk State University and Virginia State University was restored in the first year. So that reduction represents the second year amount not being restored, but the first year amounts were. About 2/3 of the way down, the conference report includes a small language amendment related to VCU's Center on Aging to indicate that that pass-through program is exempt from their institution's budget management program. And then also the row before that is the first year funding for VSU for cooperative extension. On slide 22 are additional items related to higher education, including the first two lines together total $94 million. This is $60 million funding for flexible funding in the first year for institutions. And this can be used either for operations, financial aid, or other purposes. And then the second line are the allocations for George Mason and ODU, both in the first year, and a smaller partial restoration in the second year for those two. The allocations for the institutions were based on either their own projected loss in in-state undergraduate revenue or a certain percentage of their in-state undergraduate revenue. And there is a floor level per institution of $1 million minimum. On the fifth line down, you see restoration of $2 million. That's $1 million each year for the online Virginia network. Legislation passed in the regular session added a new member to the network, James Madison University. And towards the bottom, there is also $2 million in the first year for Virginia Ready, a workforce credential program for unemployed workers through community colleges and Richard Bland. And on the bottom row, the restoration of the first year funding for VIVA, Virginia Library of Virginia, online consortium amongst the institutions. I also mentioned there is a temporary flexibility language regarding auxiliaries, requiring the institutions to consider certain fiscal health comparative measures that are compiled by the Auditor of Public Accounts. And there is also a separate amendment under SHEV regarding longer term financial sustainability. And there is one more slide on the other education institutions that completes the higher education piece on slide 23. Again, this shows the unallocated amounts which were not restored, with the exceptions being about in the middle of the column. Under Library of Virginia, the introduced budget did restore the first year funding to expedite the release of gubernatorial records in their archive function. And regarding aid to public libraries, the conference amendments restore $1 million in the first year with new language referencing mobile Wi-Fi and hotspots. In addition, for the other education institutions, as well as higher education centers, $4.5 million of the coronavirus relief fund is allocated for other education. And I will pause for questions on higher education or other education before turning it over to Tyler for K-12.
Are there questions? I don't see any. So we can go to Tyler.
And moving on to direct aid, as you'll remember, Chapter 1289 included a net increase of $1.3 billion over the biennium, with $490 million unallotted. The conference report restores approximately $87 million of those unallotments, including $37 million for early childhood expansion and $35 million for at-risk students in the second year. In addition, the conference report provides $95.2 million from gray machine revenues for COVID-19 relief payments to provide relief from increased local SOQ cost. These increased local SOQ costs resulted from the revision of sales tax dedicated to K-12. And then, as April mentioned earlier, there was $221 million that the governor distributed from the coronavirus relief funds for K-12. Moving on to the next slide, you'll see the restorations of unallotments that the governor included in his introduced budget of $7 million for the two museums, and then the early childhood educator incentive payments and the Jobs for Virginia's graduates. And then you'll see in the conference amendments that there's the restoration for the VPI expansion in the second year, the at-risk add-on in the second year, $6.6 million over the biennium to eliminate the reduced price school meals for students, and then approximately $300,000 each for Blue Ridge PBS Education Outreach and the Emil and Grace Shahida Innovation Center. And then below those restorations, you'll see the new actions. You'll see the technical update included in the governor's introduced budget for the sales tax revenue, the transfer of general fund dollars from DOE to DSS and DSS transferring TANF funds back to DOE. This is a budget neutral action to provide childcare support for school-age children. And then you'll see the non-general fund, $95.2 million for the COVID-19 local relief payments. So in taking the restorations, new actions, there's a net reduction in direct aid of $497.2 million compared to Chapter 1289. But it's important to remember that the full rebenchmarking cost of $855 million were maintained without changes in Chapter 1289. Moving on to the next slide, these are the language amendments for direct aid. There was temporary flexibility given to divisions to use textbook funding in the first year to address costs providing virtual instruction or reopening schools in-person instruction. There is language delaying the mid-year adjustments to state payments based on ADM projections until after the final March 31st ADM is calculated. There's language clarifying eligibility for the dual enrollment tuition scholarship. And then in central appropriations, there's language directing the governor to include in the introduced budget a salary increase for teachers provided sufficient revenue is projected. The next two slides detail in more detail the reductions and restorations, and I'm not going to go into those as I previously covered most of the restorations. And moving on to slide 30, at the Department of Education, there's a language amendment redirecting $8.9 million in the federal governor's education emergency relief funds to support short-term technology needs, mobile devices, and hotspots. And this would provide a total of $26.9 million to school divisions for that purpose. Madam Chair, I'll pause here if there's any questions before turning it over to Mike.
Thank you. Are there questions?
A question, Madam Chair.
Senator Favola.
Thank you. The very first slide, perhaps you could explain to me, so I want to make sure I understand it. In terms of our rebenchmarking costs, is it correct to deduct that the state met its minimal requirement on the SOQ rebenchmarking in the budget amendments, or would that be an incorrect conclusion?
Madam Chair, Senator Favola, I think the thing to remember is we've maintained the rebenchmarking cost as presented to us by DOE, which was $855 million. And these are the technical updates that occur for every biennium on rebenchmarking.
So, Madam Chair, follow-up question. So these are technical updates, but they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily bring us to the full partnership that we usually have between the state and local governments on the rebenchmarking?
This is, Madam Chair, Senator Favola, that represents the full state share for the rebenchmarking cost. I think maybe you're getting at that it doesn't address the Board of Education's SOQ recommendations that they made to the General Assembly.
It does not address that.
It does not fully fund those.
Okay, fine.
Correct.
That answers my question. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Anyone else?
Madam Chair.
Senator Bell.
Thank you. Quick question. Before we had, I know last couple of years, made agreements with higher education about reducing tuition increases and tried to tie that with some of the aid. Can you speak to that? Are we still on track with that? And where are we at with tuition, holding back on tuition increases?
Sarah, I believe that would go to you.
Thank you. This is Sarah. Turning back to higher education, there was tuition moderation incentive funding in the prior year for FY19, and then also another pot approved in the regular session budget. However, that was unallotted and reduced. In the meantime, though, the tuition report has come out, and most institutions did maintain tuition at zero this year. I've got the list of a handful of exceptions that I could follow up with Senator Bell with later.
Madam Chair. Yeah, if we could get follow-up on that, because I'm interested in those who frankly made deals with us and then didn't follow up on that, particularly during COVID. I know I've heard from many constituents and parents where we're doing distance learning and they're still paying the same amount of tuition. So if we could get follow-up on that, I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, the staff will follow up. Okay, so I believe next is Mike Tweedy with Health and Human Resources.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So for Health and Human Resources, turning to slide 32, this is just a high-level summary of the conference report amendments. So the conference report in HHR includes about $222.4 million general fund over the biennium in spending that is actually offset by identified savings in HHR of $144.7 million for a net change of $77.6 million. The general fund savings primarily reflects lower than expected managed care rates that took effect July 1st in the program. They're about 5% on the children's managed care program and a little bit in the long-term care one. The conference report does adopt the $331 million in savings from the enhanced federal match rate that was included in the introduced budget, as well as the corresponding increase in enrollment of $89 million, which is a result of the maintenance of eligibility requirement in order to receive the additional federal funds. Just a note of the most of the spending at HHR were restorations of about $208 million of items that had been unallotted back in April, and that the governor had proposed to restore in the introduced budget. About $208 million of that was restored. Turning to slide 33, this is just a quick summary. As I just mentioned, the Medicaid match rate change. So in response to COVID-19 and the economic impacts, if you recall, the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act basically increases the federal match rate for Medicaid, Virginia's Medicaid program, from 50% to 56.2% for every quarter in which there is a federal public health emergency. So far that's been captured. You can see the things there to note. But I just wanted to remind you that just last Friday, the feds actually extended this into January. So that basically means that the state will receive an enhanced federal match for that 3-month period, which based on the last estimate was about $158 million in general fund savings. That is not included in the conference report due to the late nature of it, but also because it's basically left to the governor to incorporate as part of the Medicaid forecast to offset any increased costs in FY21 there. But this is just a reminder that as long as we're under the federal emergency, the enhanced match will continue. Turning to slide 34, it's just a high-level some of the HHR amendments. So I've already talked about the match rate for Medicaid and that we capture, as well as the managed care savings. You see there's also one other non-restoration action that we took was extending the $20 a day for nursing homes. This is an action that the governor had taken in order to provide some relief to nursing homes. So the conference report extends that all the way to June 30th of 2021 to provide some stability to nursing facilities as they respond to COVID-19. The bill related to the mental health alert system, Senate Bill 5038 and House Bill 5043, there's funding for a couple positions at about $3 million for grants to create regional community programs. What you don't see on this line is that in the STEP Virginia program, which is restored, there's $11.5 million related to crisis services and mobile crisis response. So that's actually kind of associated with the bill in order to help implement it. And then lastly, this just summarizes out of almost half of the items that had been unallotted were restored in about $208 million. So just to note that there. Turning to slide 35, I won't go line by line because there's a lot of activity in HHR, but I just wanted to note that you will see that the rates were increased for the development of disability waiver services, as well as skilled and private duty nursing rates, which are two critical things that you all were trying to address in the regular session, so those are important enough to continue. Other healthcare initiatives were also restored, one of the main ones being adding an adult dental benefit for Medicaid. And then there's also overtime for personal care attendants up to 16 hours by July 1st of next year per week that they could claim. Turning to slide 36, I just note here mainly the first 4 lines that you'll see are tied to mental health. Significant additional investments were restored related to reducing the census pressure in state mental health hospitals. That's related to discharge assistance and pilot projects. and then permanent supportive housing in Step, Virginia, which are basically boosting the community-based side of mental health. You can see over $50 million that was restored in those as well. So turning to slide 37. This slide I just included in here that, like I said, not everything that was unallotted was restored, so this is just to kind of give you a list for your reference. The only thing that I would note on some of these things is one is in particular is Family First implementation. Family First is the new federal law that allows states to implement, to basically be reimbursed for foster care prevention services. And so there was significant amounts of money that had been unallotted and removed. We did put about $8.7 million back to kind of keep that going forward. That's a discussion point probably that will occur the next session to make sure that that can be funded in some way to keep it moving forward. And then the last slide that I have, 38, well, second to last slide, the next one, 38, it's just the non-general fund other amendments, HHR. This is usually surrounding the TANF program. And I would just note, you can just list, there were 5 changes to the TANF program at the bottom of this chart. Basically, they were all, the conference report is simply providing some additional support to various human service agencies in the state to help them, helping vulnerable Virginians respond to the COVID-19. And then the next slide, 39, is the last one, HHR language amendments. Again, I won't go through this, is just kind of list them out, but I'll just mention a few of them. There's one related to special education private day, which is just to try to make sure that private schools that do provide virtual support to kids, that they still receive some level of reimbursement. There's language related to access to priority testing for long-term care facilities, which was a bill that the Senate had passed, but it is in the final conference report that there should be priority for testing for residents and those facilities. There's also development of a plan for the equitable distribution of a COVID-19 vaccine or other COVID-19 medications. And the other one I would note is there's also language that requires medical facilities to allow designated persons for disabled patients. So if they need support personnel in the hospitals, you all did pass the bill to allow visitors. This language actually just kind of adds to that, and certain disabled individuals do need support personnel with them even in the hospital environment. So it lays out the procedures for that to happen. So with that, Madam Chair, that concludes HHR unless there are any questions. Otherwise, we turn it over to Caitlin Kilpatrick.
Okay, are there questions? There was a lot of activity in Health and Human Services. It was the bulk of what we were doing. Thank you, Mike. Caitlin?
Yes, Madam Chair. Next slide, please. I'll try to move quickly through this. The first 2 large bullets are reminders of what was done in Chapter 1289 and the introduced budget. There was $2.2 billion general fund in each year for public safety. 74.5 million of that was frozen or unallotted in the reconvened session, and the introduced budget proposed to remove the majority of the unallotments and added 3.6 million additional for criminal justice legislation. The conference budget restores a portion of the unallotments for high priority items, and there will be more detail on that on the next slide. And the conference report also adds to the introduced budget amounts for criminal justice legislation, and there are a couple of additional items. Sorry, I'm moving on to the next slide. Sarah, will you please go back 1 slide? Okay, this slide contains the summary level detail on the public safety actions in the conference report. The top section of the table summarizes the reductions from the unallotments. The introduced budget, as I discussed in the previous slide, has proposed to remove the majority of the unallotments, and the conference report added in an additional 11.7 million, including the restoration that was included in the introduced budget for the state police for record sealing. The conference restorations included local pretrial and probation expansion funding, pre and post incarceration services, post-critical incident support grants for law enforcement personnel, funding for electronic health records for the Department of Corrections, and funding for 2 positions for the Board of Local and Regional Jails. You can see with these restorations, the net reduction is 62.7 million. And then on the bottom of the table, there is the summary of the new actions, which included the additional funding for criminal justice legislation. With the conference amendments, there's a total of 9.5 million added for those bills, and there's more detail on that on the next slide. And sorry, I just want to go over the last two lines on the previous slide. Will you please, I don't know who's moving the slides.
Hey, Caitlin, we are having trouble hearing you. Which slide number do you want us to move the slide to?
Well, I just wanted to point out on slide, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the previous slide.
Go back one.
The previous slide before that.
What, Caitlin, what is the title of the slide? Is it maybe 42? Summary of Public Safety and Homeland Security Actions?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
There is funding in the conference report for the body-worn camera grant fund and under HB 599 for law enforcement recruitment. And then there is a language amendment to establish a work group under the Secretary of Public Safety to address deficiencies in routing E911 calls across state and county borders. Thank you. Please move to the next slide. Okay, this slide covers the funding for criminal justice legislation. And I'll just note that these amounts include some funding that's in HHR and general government. But for the mental health crisis alert system bill, which was SB 5038 on the Senate side, there is a total of 14.9 million general fund, which includes positions under DCJS and DBHDS, as well as 3 million for pilot programs under DBHDS and additional funding for STEP Virginia. And next is the DOC earned sentence credits bill, which is SB 5034 on the Senate side. There's funding of 5.8 million under DOC, which includes the necessary cost for DOC to make changes to its sentence calculation system. There's additional funding for the OAG associated with the bill. And finally, there is savings of $2.5 million under the compensation board to account for the reduction of prisoners. That's why you see the lower amount in the table. That's the net cost with the savings. For the next bill, policing reform, which is SB 5030 in the Senate, and several individual bills in the House, the conference report funds a total of $3.7 million, which includes funding for DCJS for positions for the annual training academy evaluations and positions to support additional decertification hearings, as well as funding to update the minimum training curriculum. There is additional funding for the OAG for positions related to decertification, funding under the Department of State Police for its costs, as well as funding for the associated Woodrum impacts. The expungement bill was not funded, as the conference report for that was not finalized at the point that we did the budget, but we'll point out that there's additional funding in central appropriations of $6 million that can be used for unforeseen costs. There's a note about that at the bottom of the slide. And there's funding for the OAG to conduct patterns and practices investigations. And there's funding under the parole board for the compassionate medical release provisions of SB 5018 and SB 5034. Finally, there is a Woodrum funding for HB 5098, which increases penalties for giving false reports to the police or falsely summoning law enforcement. Next slide, please. This slide contains details of the reductions and restorations in the Department of Corrections, State Police, and the Department of Criminal Justice Services. I won't go into detail because this information was included in the summary slide. Next slide, please. Again, this is just the remainder of the agencies in public safety with the details on the reductions from the unallotments. I will not go into detail on this. So moving on to veterans, please. For Veterans and Defense Affairs, in summary, Chapter 1289 had 40.4 million general fund appropriated for fiscal year 21 and 37.6 million general fund appropriated for fiscal year 2022. 6 million of that was unallotted in the reconvened session, and the introduced budget proposed to remove the unallotments, and the conference budget maintained those amounts. And on the next slide, there is a table with those details. And I will not go into those details, so that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Caitlin. Are there any questions?
Madam Chair?
Senator Morrissey.
Good evening, Caitlin. How are you? Good afternoon, Caitlin. How are you?
I'm fine, Senator Morrissey. Thank you.
Okay. If you could just speak a little bit closer to the mic, that would be great.
Sure.
I've just got a couple of questions dealing with your work on potential savings associated with the Department of Corrections. Am I correct that, according to the 2019 fiscal report from the Virginia Department of Corrections, the annual per capita cost per inmate is $32,000 a year?
Yes, that's correct. The per inmate cost on average is $32,146 per year, but that includes fixed costs related to facility maintenance and staffing.
That includes fixed costs as well as the direct cost per inmate. Am I correct?
Yes.
Do you know how many inmates there are in the Virginia Department of Corrections today?
Yes, there's about 29,000. I looked up the number. It's 28,966.
Okay. Are you familiar with Senate Bill 5007 dealing with jury trials and judge sentencing?
Yes.
Did you say yes?
Madam Chair, Senator Morrissey, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. It might just be me. I'm just having a hard time hearing you.
Senator Morrissey, we're dealing only with the...
I have one more question, Madam Chair.
We are dealing only with the fiscal matters.
Does that Madam Chair, include potential savings?
Not at this point, no.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Caitlin. Madam Chair, picking up on slide 49 in the area of agriculture and forestry. Chapter 1289 provided $12.4 million in new general fund spending, of which $2.8 million was unallotted in March. The conference report simply reverts the $2.8 million in previously unallotted spending and includes new language requiring the development of a uniform land access agreement between the Commonwealth of Virginia and the U.S. Forest Service. The following two slides provide detail on the revisions for each agency. As there were no changes, we can skip ahead to slide 53. In the area of natural resources, beginning on slide 53, Chapter 1289 had authorized new general fund spending of $142.7 million over the biennium, and $88.3 million was subsequently unallotted. The conference report restores $38 million in unallotted funding and provides $30.4 million in new spending for investments in natural resources, including an additional $34.2 million for water quality investments, $15 million for dam rehabilitation and safety improvements, $11 million for land conservation investments, $6.6 million for African American culture and history, and $1.6 million in additional state park operational support. Of the restorations, legislative actions restored only an additional $1.9 million over the $36.1 million in restorations proposed by the governor in the introduced bill. I would note that the combined water quality improvement fund deposit totals more than $80 million in general funds for the biennium, including $50.8 million in fiscal year 21 and $30.4 million for deposit in fiscal year 22. Natural resources capital outlay authorizations were also increased by $500,000 for additional investments in state park preventive maintenance. The next three slides are supporting detail on the actions for the Departments of Conservation and Recreation and Environmental Quality, which we can skip in the interest of time. Several language actions are also included in the conference report. These are outlined on slide 58. Notably, language is included to authorize a feasibility study for a Shenandoah Valley Rails to Trail project, and a proposed study on solid waste disposal fees is removed. The next three slides are supporting details on the specific actions for the Department of Historic Resources and Marine Resources. If there are no questions with respect to natural resources, I will now turn to transportation, beginning on slide 64.
Are there any questions? Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The 2020 General Assembly adopted several standalone pieces of legislation that were forecast to generate more than $1 billion in new state and regional transportation revenues. These actions have been critical to weathering the forecast reductions of almost $871 million for the 3-year period from fiscal year 20 through fiscal year 22. Next slide, please. In recognition of this funding challenge, the conference report includes language to provide the Commonwealth Transportation Board with flexibility to reprogram up to $1.1 billion in transportation revenues from existing projects and through the phased implementation of new allocation formula adopted in the 2020 regular session. It is important to note any project reallocations must be repaid within the 6-year planning window, and the language requires a 1-month comment period before final adoption by the board. The table on the right summarizes the estimated transfers for each major program. In addition, the language authorizes the shifting of mass transit funds from capital projects, ridership incentives, and special programs to statewide operating and WMATA needs for fiscal year 2021 only. Turning to the next slide, multiple language amendments are included to address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on agency operations and customer services. In addition to what was included in the introduced bill, the conference report includes language to provide courts the discretion to offer a restricted driver's license to individuals whose license was revoked pursuant to 2 non-driving sections of the code that were repealed during the 2020 regular session. Language is provided to authorize customers 75 and older to obtain any legally allowable services, either electronically or through the mail, and additional exemptions are provided for allowing the limited provision of online testing for driver training schools. Barring any transportation questions, I will now turn to Adam Rosatelli to pick up with general government and compensation.
Are there questions on transportation?
Madam Chair.
Senator Bell.
Question on transportation projects. Have we had projects that have been delayed due to COVID safety protocols that have impacted any funding projections?
Madam Chair, Senator Bell, with respect to COVID safety protocols, I don't know that I can speak to that. With respect to funding, it is my understanding that no projects have been delayed from advertising in advance of this language being approved. Currently, the 6-year improvement plan, which should have expired in June, has been extended until the passage of this language and the ability for the board to adopt a new 6-year program. So really, without the language, they don't have the flexibility to reprogram funds, but it is the intent of the words to allow for projects currently either at bid or under construction to continue in their phase, and for any funds transferred to be reallocated to those projects within that 6-year planning.
Madam Chair.
Senator Bell.
Thank you for the answer. My concern here is in many cases, tasks that require people to be in close proximity to one another have caused some delays. I know many construction practices have come up with workarounds for that, but I think that's worth us looking into as we get into the regular session to see if it has affected the timelines of any of the projects, and if so, would that require further reallocating of funds or adjustments? Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Anyone else? Okay, Adam.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, good. We advanced the slide. So this slide provides an overview of the employee compensation actions. If you recall, Chapter 1289 included $552 million in total compensation actions for state and state-supported local employees and teachers that was subsequently unallotted and removed in the governor's introduced budget. So the conference report includes 2 compensation actions. One, it provides funding of $10.9 million for a $500 one-time bonus payment for state and state-supported local law enforcement personnel in the first year on December 1st, 2020. In addition, there's another amendment in item 408 under DCGS that would provide another $7.5 million general fund for local police departments. And that would be distributed by DCGS for the purpose of attracting and retaining the most qualified law enforcement personnel and for criminal justice reform purposes. 2, it includes a second-year bonus contingent on FY21 year-end revenues meeting or exceeding the forecast and are deemed sufficient. And that would provide a $1,500 one-time bonus payment to state employees on September 1st, 2021, and a $750 one-time payment for adjunct faculty. It would also provide a 1.5% bonus payment for state-supported local employees on September 1st, 2021. And the amount of all these bonuses, if enacted, would total $97.8 million. In addition, the language also directs the governor, if there's no downward revision in the revenues, and revenues are determined again to be sufficient, to include a teacher salary incentive in the second year of the governor's next introduced budget. Next slide, please. So quickly looking at some compensation supplements and savings. So there's a reduction to the funding for the second year increase in state employee health plan premiums, essentially reducing it by half the amount provided for a projected 6.7% rate increase. However, due to sufficient balances in the health insurance fund, that amount has been lowered. Likewise, given that sufficient balance in the HIF, a 2-pay period health plan premium holiday for December 2020 is included, would generate savings of $46.1 million and would also result in savings to plan members. And there's also some language directing an actuarial review of the state health plan, and this would be performed by JLARC's contracted actuary, and JLARC would report those findings by September 30th of next year. Next slide, please. Thank you. So quickly going through some other actions in general government. So there's funding, as Caitlin mentioned, related to courts and OAG costs for criminal justice reform bills that have passed. There's a $4 million NGF appropriation for legal aid housing attorneys. That reflects the $2 million IKEA grant and a $2 million match from the COVID-19 Relief Fund. Funding and language related to the removal and storage of the Lee statue. And then you can see the elections, the removal of funding and language, given that Chapter 1 of this session replaced that funding and that language. And then there's $89 million moved from the second year for potential FY24 rainy day fund deposit moved to the first year of the revenue reserve, with language providing flexibility for any constitutionally required rainy day fund deposit over the biennium. Next slide, please. All right, so wrapping up here. So a few more items. There's a $500,000 reversion from World War I and II Commemoration Commission FY20 balances. The next few items, that reflects about $16.1 million in judicial position restorations for the 19th Judicial District, District Court clerks, and public defender positions. And then you can see a few other items there. You can see about $328 million was not restored. Most of that is related to a $300 million deposit to the revenue reserve. Next slide, please. All right, just a couple more here. So there's a $275,000 non-general fund transfer to the general fund that reflects VSAP balances. And then there's the revised utility disconnection moratorium language. And actually, if you go to the next slide, please, so this provides detail on some of the major provisions related to the utility disconnection moratorium. In the interest of time, I won't go through all those unless otherwise directed, but I certainly, that concludes my portion of the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Are there any questions? It looks like there aren't, Adam.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe Sarah is on Capitol L again. Thank you.
Okay, Sarah.
Thanks. Slide 74 is the last slide. There were just a few changes in capital outlay. Chapter 1289 did include a $3.3 billion capital outlay program for the biennium from all fund sources, and there was just a small amount of general funds involved. The introduced budget recommended removing the $21 million in general funds across the three areas impacted, 2 projects and a capital planning pool. The conference report instead changed the funding source for those 2 projects to bonds, and also added $500,000 for the critical infrastructure repairs at parks. And there were several technical amendments as well. And that completes the presentation on the conference report for the budget.
Okay, is there a question for Sarah?
Yes, ma'am.
Senator Norman.
Madam Chairman, I don't mean to be preemptive. My questions are not on this specific topic, but on the overall report. I apologize.
That's fine.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I came in just a little late, and as I read over the Joint Conference Committee report on House Bill 5005, and was pointed out in higher education that approximately $60 million additional funding was put into higher education that was not originally in the Senate budget. My question, Madam Chairman, is was there any comparable amount of dollars in that large a category that were moved from the House budget to the Senate budget in any other area?
Let me have April answer that for you.
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, Senator Norman is correct. The largest one that I can identify would be the additional higher ed funding. As you might remember, the Senate budget had funding for George Mason and Old Dominion, whereas the House amendment had a much larger package. The only two other ones that I'll point out, since they're just slightly higher amounts, is the amount because of the bill in conference for the earned sentence credit bill. That has a higher amount, though some of it is netted with savings over in Comp Board. And then there's additional money with the way that we assume the mental health awareness bills are going to be conferenced. There's $3 million for pilot programs related to what was in the House bill that we believe will be in conference. But those are the ones I could identify.
Madam Chair, I thank her. And the only other question I had, and Madam Chair, I would direct our director's attention to pages 82 and 83 of the printed conference report. Madam Chairman, I'll preface an editorial comment before the question. It was my perspective that during the reconvened session that the legislative body abdicated some of its responsibility by giving the discretionary farm away to the governor. As I read paragraph G on the bottom of page 82 and the top of page 83, it appears to me that we are granting additional authority to the governor to shift around unspent allocations of the CARES fund if it does not meet a certain deadline. Is that accurate?
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, I would say yes, but it does stipulate that for those items in paragraph B, and then remaining amounts then would go to the unemployment insurance trust fund. And I would argue that that's probably more specific than and less flexible perhaps than the authority that was given during the reconvened session.
Madam Chair, a follow-up, please. With that new language that is inserted in there, says he shall have the authority to shift unspent allocations to any other purpose outlined in paragraph B. Has anything changed in there that would either require or allow legislative input in the shifting of those funds within paragraph B, or is it restricted to the unilateral discretion of the governor?
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, I would argue that yes, it is up to the governor. However, he is required newly to, within making allocations, I'll refer you to paragraph D, within 2 days, make that plan available via electronic means to the chairs and the money committees.
Madam Chair, thank you, and I thank April.
Are there further questions? Senator Peterson.
Madam Chair, I want to follow up on what was sort of obliquely referenced by Senator Norman, Senator from James City County. This issue of the Unemployment Trust Fund, I don't see any specific reference to the Unemployment Trust Fund. I know it's been upside down for several months. Are we applying CARES Act money to that? I mean, what is the story on that? I don't see that specifically being addressed.
Madam Chair, Senator Peterson, if in that same amendment that Senator Norman was referencing earlier, there is a $210 million allocation specified under the Virginia Employment Commission to the Unemployment Assistance Trust Fund, and that is on page 78 of the conference report packet of amendments. And I will also point you to, there is language that says, allows it to go to the unemployment compensation fund on page 83 there at the top, that last sentence. So it does reference a specific amount at 210 million, and then language that allows him to if the date gets pushed and above that, if allocations aren't made to others, that the remaining balance should go to the unemployment trust fund.
Madam Chair.
And I would just add, there's one small amount additional for a staff person to work with legislators to help us help our constituents.
Okay. Madam Chair, just one follow-up.
Yes, Senator Peterson.
And I'm looking at, that was very helpful. I'm looking at that central appropriations. I take it that 210 million is all CARES Act money?
Madam Chair, Senator Peterson, yes, it is.
All right, thanks.
Okay, any other question? Okay, well, thank you, staff. You have done a spectacular job as always.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And we're adjourned and can go into regular session.